And then as apple production grew, and we saw it improve, and apples start to go and be known all over the world, Washington State apples. How do we sort them? How do we wash them? How do we clean them? How do we pack them? How do we not bruise them? And how do we get them to market? That story is told as well. And you can imagine, how do you spread the word? How do you talk about producing materials to tell the other farmers and other a location where a wide variety of organizations and groups of all kinds of ethnic and racial backgrounds have enjoyed one location together. A spot where they could come to see their favorite performer, or perhaps could come and listen to a lecture.
The Joint Legislative Audit and Review Committee is opening up its hearing on the State Auditor's Office performance audit on hybrid electric ferries, design, build, contracting, and procurement. Today is February 16th, 2023, and I want to thank the members of the committee who have already made it here following floor action. We will do a quick roll call of JLARC members. This meeting is both virtual and in person in hearing room A of the House Office building, where the State Auditor's Office staff is going to be physically present to present the audit. I will be looking and checking on Zoom if we have anyone participating on Zoom who, if you are, please use your raise hand function if you have a question. And then, of course, if you are physically present here in the room, please use your raise hand function as well. Secretary of JLARC Orcutt would like to make a pun or two this afternoon.
I always make puns.
So I will alert everyone to stay tuned. And I believe that takes care of the initial business. The audit on the hybrid electric ferries is the only audit in front of us. And as a reminder, the performance audit statute requires the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Committee to hold a hearing on each performance audit within 30 days. So that is why we are convening today. And, oh, this is JLARC study. My gosh. I'm just so used to us being a 900 meeting. Excuse me. Look, the JLARC staff is here. Eric and Rebecca are presenting. And thank you, Legislative Auditor Thomas. With that, would our staff please quickly run through the roll call of JLARC members who are present?
Representative Berg. Representative Fye.
Here.
Representative Gaynor.
Here.
Senator Hasagawa. Senator Lovelet. Senator Mullet. Representative Orcutt.
Here.
Representative Paulette.
Here.
Senator Rivers. Senator Saldana. Senator Short. Representative Stokesbury. Senator Wagoner.
Wagoner is present.
Senator Wilson. We have 5 in attendance. We do not have a quorum.
Thank you for that. We will postpone action on the minutes. I know everyone will be greatly disappointed by that. And we will now proceed to the audit, and Eric Whitaker and Rebecca Connolly will take us through that. I'd like to just ask that we pause after every few slides to see if there are questions, if that's okay with you. And please introduce yourselves, and instead of taking it away, would you sail it away?
Touche. Good afternoon, Chair Pollitt, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Eric Whitaker, and I'm joined by my colleague Rebecca Connolly, and we're staff to this committee. Today, we're presenting the preliminary report for our review of Washington State Ferry's approach to design, build, contracting, and procurement for hybrid electric ferries, where the legislative auditor concludes the legislature should consider revising state law to allow alternatives to increase ferry acquisition speed and value to the state. In addition, that the Washington State Department of Transportation Ferries Division should improve its cost estimation, payment, and other practices. I will begin with some background for our review. In the 2022 Supplemental Transportation Budget, the legislature directed JLARC staff to compare State Ferries policies and practices for design-build contracting to industry best practices and to make recommendations to benefit the ferry system as a whole, as well as any recommendations related to statutory updates. Also to assess opportunities to decrease vessel construction costs and ensure operational efficiencies. JLARC staff contracted with Vard Marine Incorporated, a firm with expertise in marine engineering and procurement, to assist in this work. Vard's full report is included as an appendix to our report and includes suggestions that are not reflected in the legislative auditor recommendations. And while these additional suggestions don't rise to the level of audit recommendations, we did share them with State Ferries in advance for their consideration going forward. With us this morning on Zoom is Andrew Kendrick from the Vard team, and Mr. Kendrick is a principal naval architect with over 45 years of experience in marine consultancy and ship design. Andrew is not participating in the JLARC staff presentation, but is available for questions. State Ferry's path forward is outlined in their long-range plan and system electrification plan, and the vision is to increase the fleet size to 26 vessels to shift from diesel to plug-in hybrid electric vessels, and this is consistent with direction from both the governor and the legislature. Currently, State Ferries is working to acquire 5 plug-in electric hybrids. These will be 144 car capacity vessels, similar to the 4 diesel vessels that were built by Vigor shipyards and put into service in 2012 and 2018, between 2012 and 2018. These will be the first vessels purchased under the 2015 procurement laws, and State Ferries sought to extend the contract with Vigor. However, negotiations between the two parties broke down. but State Ferries is planning to issue an RFP in the coming weeks. Statute requires that Washington State Ferries use design-build fixed-price contracting for new acquisitions. And the design-build approach has previously been allowed but is now required under the 2015 procurement laws. Under a design-build approach, one shipbuilder provides both design and construction services. Ferry acquisitions, as you might imagine, are projects with significant schedule, technical, and cost risk, and Washington uses the design-build approach to locate most of that risk with the shipbuilder, who must meet the schedule and technical requirements, and a fixed-price contract also transfers cost risk to the shipbuilder, who must provide the vessel at a fixed price even if there are cost overruns. Shipbuilders may increase the price to account for the additional risk, and State Ferries does use contract provisions to share some of the risk. So for example, materials escalation clauses might share the risk for price fluctuations in copper and steel-based materials. I'll now turn it over to Rebecca to discuss findings related to cost estimating and acquisitions.
Thanks, Eric. Good afternoon, everyone. So for the next few minutes, I'll be talking about State Ferries cost estimating practices. So best practices call for refining estimates as the project progresses and more information is known. And State Ferries uses standard methods to do this. At the beginning of a project, in the early planning stages, it uses common top-down methods called parametric estimating. And simply put, a parametric estimate takes information about the cost drivers from historical vessels and uses that to project the cost of a new vessel. Later in the project, when more is known and the designs are becoming more mature, there's a better idea about what equipment will be used, Ferries shifts to using bottom-up estimates. And a bottom-up estimate looks at individual line items to establish the cost. And later in the presentation, you'll hear me mention a specific type of bottom-up estimate called an engineer's estimate. So while Ferries is using these standard methods to develop its estimates, the information it's sharing publicly, say with OFM, with the legislature, with the legislative staff, excludes important explanations about the estimates. So the estimated cost of the hybrid electric Olympic ferry has increased over the last 4 years. And while this is to be expected, the information provided with the estimates doesn't clearly explain what caused the change. Was it inflation or was it design changes? What is included in the estimate? Does it reflect materials for future vessels or just for the one vessel? What were the methods used to create that estimate? And how much more might that estimate change as more becomes known? This lack of documentation can cause confusion about how good the estimate is and whether it's comparable to previous or future estimates. And lack of documentation is also contrary to best practice. So you'll note Ferries is also producing estimates that are a single point, say $188 million for a ferry. A better approach is to provide a range, and we're talking about using a probabilistic approach. State Ferries' parent agency, WashDOT, already uses a probabilistic approach for civil engineering projects that are expected to cost more than $100 million. So I'm going to walk through the basics of the probabilistic approach. It starts with an estimator determining the most likely cost for each line item, and then determining the confidence level for those costs. So for example, if they're looking at a specific piece of equipment, they will have a higher confidence in a supplier quote for that piece of equipment than they would in the price of that equipment in a previous procurement. The estimator then adds the costs together to create a distribution of the possible total costs. So in this chart, each column reflects the likelihood of each possible cost there. The estimator then considers the cumulative likelihood. So imagine each of those bars stacked on top of each other to create the blue line. And that line presents the range of total possible costs. And you can look at the blue dot indicates the 60% likelihood that the cost will be at or below that point. A probabilistic approach can and should be applied to each top-down or bottom-up estimate. The legislative auditor has two
Let me
recommendations.
just pause.
Sure.
I
Yes,
didn't realize
absolutely.
when you nodded at me, you were waiting to see if we had questions. Does anyone have questions at this stage other than me? Any- Senator Wagner.
It's not to the brief, it's to the fact that I can't find the brief on the EBB. Is it not loaded? I mean, we have paper copies, so that's good.
The agenda that you received in your email should have a link to,
Okay.
document.
It's not in the EBB is all.
No, it's not in the electronic bill book. Okay. Or it is in the EBB also? All right. Chair Fye.
Thank you, Chair Paulette. So this, what you call a probabilistic approach, did I hear you correctly that that is used on projects at WashDOT that are over $100 million, but it's not used in this particular case? Is that correct?
That is correct. Ferries has not used it to date. They are planning to use the approach that WashDOT uses for the hybrid electric Olympic ferry. They have not done so to date, but they are planning to make it part of, they say they are planning to make it part of their process.
Or with the next procurement?
Before the next RFP goes out for the hybrid electric Olympics.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Orcutt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When the engineer confers with shipbuilders to try and determine what costs would be, how many shipbuilders are there in our state that are eligible to bid on ferry construction?
There is a process outlined in state law that allows ferries to, when they issue the RFP, there's also qualification questions that they can use, and the criteria are outlined in state law. The shipyards that meet those qualifications can proceed to the second phase of the process and develop proposals that would then have an engineer's estimate assigned to them. At this point, I could not tell you which shipbuilders would meet those criteria because it would be part of the RFP process.
My question has to do with the current estimates. So the current estimate is a single point, and they do not prepare a high, mid, and low based on varying assumptions such as inflation estimates or any other factors. It's just one point.
The estimate that is provided with the budget documents is a single point. They do apply an inflation factor to that, and that is part of it. In their internal documentation, it cites which inflation factor they're using. It's not part of the documentation that's provided with the budget estimate.
But that would be one of, even where people don't use probabilistic estimation, looking at individual key procurement items, isn't it normal practice to have a high, low, and mid based on several key assumptions such as high inflation and other very clear, easily observed factors?
You certainly could do a high, medium, low, and that is discussed at length in documents such as GAO's cost estimating guide.
Thank you. All right. Any other questions on estimation? All right. Go to recommendations.
So there are two recommendations regarding state ferries cost estimating practices. First, that state ferries should ensure that its cost estimates are clear and well documented. And second, that it should apply probabilistic approaches to the estimates. And these approaches should clearly indicate the likelihood of a cost falling at or below the funding level that ferries is requesting. So next we want to talk about the RFP and contract award approaches that are allowed in statute. State law requires ferries to award vessel contracts based on the lowest bid. In a low bid, price is the only factor. State ferries can award a contract to the shipbuilder that meets the RFP requirements at the lowest price. A common alternative is a best value selection approach. And in best value, the contract is awarded based off the relative importance of price compared to other factors that may be equally or more important than that price. When shipbuilders know the priority and the criteria, they can focus their proposals on elements that provide the greatest overall value to the state. These types of criteria can encourage shipbuilders to offer designs that lower life cycle costs. They can reflect current legislative priorities such as the build location or the use of small or minority-owned businesses. And they also can be used to evaluate the shipbuilders' facilities, their expertise, experience with new technologies such as hybrid electric propulsion, and their ability to meet the project schedule. Best value selection is an industry standard, and it is very common in projects like ferry acquisitions where the requirements are less clear and the risks are high. Commonly used in federal procurements, and it is approved in Washington for use by WashDOT Civil Engineering, and the 2021 legislature approved it for use by any county that is purchasing electric ferries. The legislative auditor is recommending that the legislature consider allowing state ferries to use a best value selection process. This would require an amendment to current state law. State law also requires ferries to use a phased approach to design build contracting. These are the phases I was mentioning before. The initial RFP is sent only to Washington state shipbuilders. And should note that, as Eric noted at the beginning, ferries is moving into a new procurement process for the hybrid electric Olympic ferries. They plan to issue a new RFP in the first quarter of this year, which would put them in this first phase. State ferries may only seek out-of-state bids if all of the Washington shipbuilders have offer a fixed price that is more than 5% above the engineer's estimate. So an engineer's estimate, like I said, is a bottom-up estimate. It's based on detailed information and developed designs, which makes it unique to each bid. It can be difficult for the fixed prices to be within 5% of the engineer's estimate because the estimate focuses on cost. A fixed bid is a price which is also going to include that shipbuilder's assumptions about risk tolerance, profit, and productivity, and other factors. And so estimators are going to try to account for those factors, but there's still a great deal of uncertainty about what the prices will look like because the information is often confidential and reflects market conditions and competition. This two-step process can also add time. In fact, State Ferries estimates that it can add up to a year to the project schedule. We learned that other states are offering in-state preferences for shipbuilding and other construction activities. Typically, they are using one RFP and building the in-state preference into the selection criteria. For example, they may offer additional evaluation points to in-state shipbuilders during the scoring process. They may allow state agencies to choose an in-state bidder that offers a higher price as long as that price is within a set percentage of a low bid, out-of-state bid. And they also may give preference to out-of-state firms that have demonstrated in-state partnerships. The legislative auditor is recommending that the legislature consider allowing state ferries to offer a single nationwide RFP that offers in-state preference. This could increase competition and protect against the risk of that longer procurement process.
Up for any questions? Senator Wagoner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Going back to low bid versus best value, it looks like best value is pretty amorphous in terms of what the criteria are. Is there sort of a national standard or a best practice so that that doesn't go in a illogical, for example, if it's not built in my district, or if it is built in my district, that's a great value and I put a lot of weight on that. You can see how we could kind of run up a very expensive buy if we didn't have some sideboards on what best value means.
There are certainly, I don't know that you could say that there's a national standard for what best value would be, because it is going to be specific to what is the best value to the purchaser. But certainly you want a set of criteria that could be scored. We can get back to you with common lists of what those criteria may be.
You don't need to do that, but it's in my head that we need to be cautious of that.
Chair Fye.
Thank you. I just follow on to Senator Wagner's great question. So some of these things could be quantified, such as the operating costs for fuel, how many people it takes to operate the ferry could be quantified in terms of dollars saved by having less people, and cost to preserve and maintain the vessel could be something that could be quantified. Is that what's inherent in this pre-design study commentary here in your report?
In the pre-design or in the best value?
Best value, yes.
Yes, you would absolutely need to establish a way to quantify and consistently measure any of the criteria, so that it would be part of developing an RFP. If it were to use a best value selection, you need to be able to say, this is how we will measure it, so that you have a fair competition.
So it could be a mix of tangible and some less tangible considerations.
Yes, as long as there is a clear way that the responses will be measured.
Thank you.
Thank you. That did a large part of the question I had. So, which basically, in a nutshell, then the RFP could say that one of the criteria is life cycle cost over X period of time. Is that correct?
Wouldn't want to opine on exactly how you would write an RFP. I think that's a better question for contract specialists and lawyers, but it certainly could address that. Yes, we are seeking, a priority for the state would be to lower life cycle costs and have a design that does so in a proven way.
And is there, did you look at the appropriateness of design build contracts with immature technology? So if the experience with hybrid electric ferries is very limited, did you look at whether design build is the most appropriate way to contract? And for example, how, as the GAO reviews and U.S. Army Corps advice on use of design build for immature technology versus mature technology projects?
So our consultant VAR did look at domestic and international best practices for acquiring hybrid electric ferries. Design build is less common among U.S. ferry owners, more common internationally for these types of purchases.
I would also just add that Bard's work also suggests that design bid build is more common for new technology than for established technology.
Thank you. Any other questions? Let's go to the next section.
So in this section, I'll discuss pre-design studies, life cycle costs, and contract payment strategies. Opportunities to control life cycle costs for ferries are greatest early in a project. And as the horizontal slide shows, the major project phases, as a project moves from pre-design to construction to operation, it logically becomes more complete. However, there's an inverse relationship between project progress and the influence over life cycle costs. After construction begins, opportunities to reduce long-term operational costs are minimal. The best opportunities to control life cycle costs occur during the pre-design and the design phases when the technical and contractual requirements are being developed. This control is important because according to the Government Accountability Office, approximately 70% of a vessel's life cycle costs are experienced after construction. And additionally, that percentage might be larger for vessels that have a 50 to 60-year lifespan, such as Washington's ferries. In the project planning phase, vessel requirements can be explored using pre-design studies. And while Washington State Ferries completed multiple pre-design studies for its recent acquisitions, their pre-design work could better assess life cycle costs. For the hybrid electric Olympic class, State Ferries completed multiple pre-design studies exploring such topics as vessel wake, conversion to plug-in hybrid electric propulsion, and battery bank design. According to State Ferries, stakeholder input and industry trends inform the selection of their pre-design topics. VARD found that while these topics are valid, the approach may exclude topics such as the potential for new technology to impact crew size and training. And a more systematic approach may incorporate information about cost drivers based on the experience with vessels that are currently in service. Statute requires the pre-design work to include information on long-term operating costs for preservation, fuel efficiency, and staffing. And State Ferries pre-design studies for both the diesel and the hybrid electric Olympic class included this for fuel efficiency and preservation, but did not include long-term staffing costs. This leads us to the next legislative auditor recommendation that State Ferries should ensure pre-design studies evaluate the long-term costs as directed by statute, and that the suite of studies for each acquisition project address the most significant potential life cycle cost drivers. Our review also found that State Ferries has few cost and schedule reporting requirements in its recent contracts, and that State Ferries currently pays its shipbuilders based on estimated monthly progress. So during these prior acquisitions, payments for work completed during the detailed design and construction phases were based on shipbuilders' estimates of progress each month. However, the contracts note that estimates are tentative and should only be used for determining payments and are not evidence of progress or acceptability. State Ferries reports that this approach is administratively simple, easy to manage, and that payments help to assist the shipbuilders in paying their subcontractors and suppliers. Best practice, however, involves linking contract payments to milestones or verifiable progress. So payments can be linked to milestones or major events, such as final design review, steel cutting, or trials. And alternatively, earned value approaches account for cost, work scope, and schedule, so they encompass more information in making that decision. In each payment period, the planned value of work is compared to the actual value of work completed, and the shipbuilder is paid for measurable progress. So earned value management is well suited for complex projects with high risk and high cost, and both the federal government and private shipbuilding contracts recognize EVM as a best practice. This leads to the next legislative auditor's recommendation that State Ferries should tie shipbuilder payments to significant milestones and project progress.
Let me stop. Any other questions, right? Representative Gaynor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I know this wasn't quite in the scope of what you were tasked with doing, but I'm just thinking about what we're doing and trying to get the best value. When you're talking about best value, is there a mechanism where, in this case, when DOT was doing the assessment, that they could have interjected that in order to accomplish what was intended with a hybrid ferry, that there may have been another alternative that could have performed as well or better. And I'm thinking, when we're talking about the long-term effects and the technology that we've mentioned, you're looking at there's a lot of supposition, I guess, as to what the efficiency of that vessel will be based on some past history on certain elements of the structure. But when we're talking about batteries, for example, they do have a life expectancy that will come into play. I mean, so this going back to my question, I mean, is there an appropriate time for DOT in this process to say, there may be a better alternative to actually deliver a better product to the state of Washington than what we're pursuing?
Are you asking about the content of the pre-designed studies, or sort of a comparison of competing technologies for the propulsion systems?
Well, I guess I'm asking in the scope of things, because you were looking at what was being done with the hybrid electric. That was your task. But I'm just wondering if in the process, if DOT, is there ever a time where it's appropriate for them to say, this may not be the best investment for the state in trying to achieve, a vessel that, building a ferry?
I think part of that is involved in the pre-design process. If there's elements of technology or something, that's something that should come out of that pre-design study, but I would probably defer to state ferries to elaborate more on their specific activities for the hybrid electric.
Would you take a minute to discuss, under the current contracting approach, what the incentives and cost or risk sharing is under the contract in terms of schedule and cost? If we are making progress payments, what are there incentives or penalties essentially for not making specific milestones or having cost exceedances at certain points in time? Is there any risk sharing here, especially on schedule?
I think that might be a good question for Andrew from VARD to answer, or for State Ferries to answer. VARD did the analysis of the contract terms and could speak to the specifics more clearly than we could.
Thank you. Any other questions before we go to the next set of presentation? Right.
So part 4, last part of the presentation before the summary. So here I'm going to talk about the lack of State Ferries documented policies reflecting current laws and best practices, and then Rebecca is going to provide a summary of the report. So for the materials reviewed for this study, they indicate that State Ferries has complied with laws in place at the time of the recent acquisitions, but the Vessel Engineering Manual, their primary policy document, has not been updated to reflect changes to procurement laws from 2015. And these changes include requiring design-build fixed-price contracts, hiring an independent owner's representative to oversee certain aspects of the project, including change orders, stipulating a nationwide request for proposal if none of the bids from the initial in-state RFP are within 5% of the engineer's estimates, and stipulating the contingency limitation of 5% of the contract price and the involvement of the Office of Financial Management in overseeing the spending. In the absence of documented policies, State Ferries relies heavily on staff expertise and consultants, and this could leave State Ferries vulnerable if it experiences turnover or retirements. So effective documentation that is updated as statute and best practices evolve would record and retain organizational knowledge, would help to mitigate the risk associated with having knowledge limited in a few key personnel, and provide consistent means of communicating information and knowledge with external parties such as consultants in the legislature. This leads us to the final legislative auditor recommendation, that state ferries should update its ferry acquisition policies and procedures to reflect current laws and best practices.
So we have shared a lot of detailed information, and so I just want to wrap up by reminding you of a few of the key points today. The legislative auditor concluded that the legislature should consider allowing alternatives that increase the speed of ferry acquisitions and the value to the state, and that Washington State Ferries should improve its cost estimation, payment, and other practices. There are two legislative auditor recommendations to the legislature. First, that it consider amending state law to allow ferries to use best value selection. And second, that it consider allowing ferries to offer a single nationwide RFP that offers in-state preference. There are 5 legislative auditor recommendations to state ferries. First, that it ensure cost estimates are clear and well documented, and that it also apply probabilistic approaches, that it ensure that its pre-designed studies are evaluating life cycle cost drivers, that it tie its payments to significant milestones or measurable progress, and that it ensure that its policies and procedures reflect current laws and best practices. As Eric noted at the start, the VARD report is part of a report online. It includes additional suggestions, information, and reference materials. Our proposed final report will be available in May, and our contact information is here. We're happy to answer any further questions that you have or provide additional briefings or presentations. By the magic of Zoom, we have Andrew Kendrick from VARD available to answer questions, as well as Patty Ribstello and Matt Von Ruden from State Ferries. Thank you.
Thank you. And they're available, they're online?
They are online today.
Great. Any questions for Rebecca and Eric before we? Please, Senator.
So going back to the recommendations to Washington State Ferries, number 4, the tying payments, is there a recommendation to them of a specific type of contracting that benefits that form of payment? So I'm familiar with something called performance-based contracting. In the Navy, we use it, kind of a double-edged sword. You meet your milestones, you get a bonus. You don't meet them, you get penalized. Is that what's being recommended here, or is it not that specific?
We are not that specific with it. It is more that it should be tied to significant project milestones or measurable progress.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I think that is exactly, we should work together for comments in May. So the next step here is JLARC will consider adoption of the final report in May. We will have an opportunity to circulate any comments of Joint Legislative Audit and Review Committee members on that, and I'd welcome the opportunity to work with you. And I think there will be some other interest, including recommendations on performance-based contracting, which aren't adopted as part of the report, but they accompany the report if we adopt them as a committee. With that, I'd like to first ask if Andrew Vard would like to, Andrew Kendrick from VARD, excuse me, would like to offer any insights from the questions that we've asked about based on the work that he has done.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to present today. I think I have to rely on the coordinator to start my my camera, but hopefully I'm audible. Let me first say that we really enjoyed working on this project.
Wait,
with
one second. Is he have control of his own camera, or? And secondly, while we can hear you, would you also, when we make sure you can be on visual, introduce yourself for the record as well, okay? Give us just a moment here.
Yeah, I think you're still in control of my video. Ah, there we go.
Okay. There we are.
Okay, so yes, thank you again, Mr. Chair. I'm Andrew Kendrick. I'm one of the VARD team who's been working on this project. There were a number of us who contributed to this, and I've drawn the short straw to be on the video today. I'm a naval architect. I've worked in the industry as I think Eric said at the start for many years. I have just retired as the president of the Society of Naval Architects and Marine Engineers. So I've knocked around for a while, and I've been involved in vessel procurement in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, in the Far East, on a range of projects, including many ferry programs. So we brought a fair amount of expertise to this project. We enjoyed working with the JLARC staff. As I said, we found them very professional and very informative of the nuances of process in Washington State. And I'd also like to acknowledge that the quality of our report depends highly on the very high level of cooperation which we got from state ferries, who were very, very frank and open about all of their challenges, all of their issues, all of their successes, and even some of their failures. So real kudos to their team for being so open with ourselves and with JLARC. So in terms of some of the specific points that were raised, I think one question which Rebecca forwarded back to us was the question of incentives and penalties in existing contracts. We have not seen the final RFP which ferries are planning to issue for the new vessels, but traditionally their contracts have been light on incentives and fairly light on penalties. There's been use of what we know in the trade as liquidated damages. So if there's a late delivery, you're penalized for late delivery. If there's a shortfall in key aspects of performance, you're penalized on those aspects of performance. And there is also the fundamental sanction that if the vessel doesn't perform, then you may not receive final payments. This in turn comes back to the question of the progress payment approach, where we have a lot of experience with what the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Coast Guard does with other government agencies and also with private sector contractors. And as was mentioned, what we consider is that the earned value management approach, which takes a realistic view of the progress that's been achieved and links payments to that level of progress, is the current best practice for limiting the risk to the client and ensuring that the contractor is appropriately paid for the work that they've been done. And we note that one of the major shipyards in Washington State already applies earned value management both to some of its federal contracts upwards and also downwards to its own subcontractors. So the other issue, the question of is design build the best approach? As was mentioned, we consider that that is an appropriate strategy for simple projects. For more complex projects, there are major advantages in looking at the separation into a design then build phase to have a two-phase process, so that there is more of a level playing field for the shipyards that are bidding on this, and that the end client has a much firmer view of the product that they're going to get. So if anyone has additional questions on aspects that have been raised in the JLARC presentation, I'll do my very best to answer them. And we are available after this session to answer any additional questions that anyone may raise.
Thank you very much for being available and sharing your expertise with us in person as well as on the contract today. Any questions? Okay, let's turn to our state ferries and Department of Transportation. We have Patty Rebstello, the Assistant Secretary for State Ferries, and Matt Van Ruden, Director of Vessel Engineering and Maintenance.
Well, thank you, Representative Pollitt. Appreciate the opportunity. As mentioned, Patty Rebstill, Assistant Secretary for Washington State Ferries. And I just wanted to share that not only Washington State Ferries, but the Department of Transportation always appreciates engaging in these audits. And I also want to say that it's been a pleasure working with this audit team. Our teams worked very well together, really sharing information, and appreciate hearing and learning about the latest and greatest on best practices around vessel contracting. With that, I'm going to turn over Matt. Matt Von Ruden's our program administrator for electrification, and he might be able to answer any of your more detailed questions. We're still digesting the recommendations, and we'll be providing a formal response to those in the coming weeks. Matt, is there anything you'd like to add?
Hello, I'm Matt Von Ruden, the Washington Ferries System Electrification Program Administrator. I've been with ferries about 7.5 years, and before that had a 23-year career with the U.S. Coast Guard and experience in the shipbuilding industry. And I'm glad to follow up on any of the questions that the committee feels still need an answer, either now or I can take that and get back to you.
Well, I think the most fundamental question is, where are you in the development of an RFP in terms of taking into account these recommendations, such as incorporating performance-based contracting and life cycle cost considerations as part of the qualifications and criteria?
Thank you. Yes, we, as mentioned, are moving forward in the final preparations of an RFP that is compliant with the current statutes. So a lot of the things mentioned are not consistent with the current statutes, and we've made an effort to achieve the outcomes the best way possible within the current statutes. So, example, with pre-design studies, you saw some of them that we've done. Others, concerns about crew costs, we are addressing crewing in our draft RFP and our requirements, although we don't have a formal pre-design study. As far as the payments, and I think the past contracts that were looked at for our payment processes, the contracts did finish on time and a very small amount of contract growth. So the topics of earned value management, we'll certainly, I'm glad to take those recommendations and assess those and how it would match with our staffing levels and so forth.
I guess I would like to ask for something a little more concrete than that. Perhaps a response saying within existing, a written response to share with the chairs of transportation committees and JLARC members what can be done. You've got the recommendations and what can be done within existing statutes, and whether or not you'd be asking for additional statutory changes, which might be necessary to implement the budget and therefore still able for us to consider. But it seems like we don't want the ship to sail without the opportunity to incorporate these significant questions, including I'm familiar in having had an opportunity to the same basic procurement statutes apply for local governments and help supervise 3-year review with CPARB on that and MRSC, and we had very strong expert opinions that the criteria would allow, the development of bid criteria would allow for incorporation of many of the things we discussed today without statutory changes. So I would encourage you to be looking at that, as well as there was also concern in the report about updating your own manuals to reflect current statutes, and where are we on that?
Yes, all the recommendations we'll take a close look at and provide a response in writing per the process outlined there.
And I'll also just add that we kind of seeing where the audit recommendations were heading, we have already started to engage both chairs of the transportation committees to talk about some of the legislation that would be necessary to fully implement the recommendations that have been put forward.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary. The chair of the House Transportation Committee obviously had to leave, so I'm flying blind here in terms of whether or not there was that discussion, so I appreciate that. Encourage it to continue. Any other comments or questions from our members? I want to thank you very much for your cooperation, your work with JLARC. I really want to thank the JLARC team for, this is just a really important audit and an example of incredible value to the entire state, not just the people who will rely on ferry system for the next 100 years. So thank you very much. And with that, unless we have any other announcements, we are adjourned. Thank you very much. There, I'll do that just for the